Before I begin, I really want to extend the greetings of peace to each of you and to your families and loved ones. And I extend that greeting for a couple of reasons. One, because I'm hoping that you are actually finding ways to maintain peace in your lives. And then second of all, it is just a greeting, so to speak. And this issue of peace is one that in varying degrees human beings strive for. And in some of the communities where we had the privilege and the challenge to do work, there often was not peace. And so among other things, we saw ourselves as peacekeepers and peace bringers. And so I invite you all to, first of all, continue to do the very important work that you do. But I also invite you to think about the people who report to you, the ones who are, if you're not one of those or some of those, the ones who are doing the day-to-day work with children, with families. This whole notion of secondary trauma is a very powerful construct that we had a sense of back then, but we didn't have the language for it. And so paying attention to the needs of your staff, paying attention to yourselves, taking care of yourselves, is all a part of this greeting of peace to you. And I want to really just take a moment to thank all of you for inviting me here. It's a real privilege and very exciting to have a chance to come back and kind of reminisce and even reinvigorate ourselves, because we have so much more work to do. But it doesn't hurt sometime to just kind of think about what we have tried to contribute, what we may have accomplished, while we also take measure of what yet has to be done. And so some of the people that are here today, I will be forever in their debt. Dr. Schaefer, Gary Stangler, Dr. Boardman. There was a fourth, Dr. Bagby, representing health. And I don't know if he is still with us physically and spiritually, but if not, he is with us in spirit. And then I also want to just bring up the name of Jane Payne, who I think was probably the one who brought those four kings together to think about how to deliver services differently. And I hope that she is still with us on this earth, but if not, she is still with us in the work that we do. And then, of course, with those five individuals at the foundation, we were able to make a huge leap forward with the late Governor Mel Carnahan, who had the vision to expand this and to help codify this work through state statute under the leadership of those four kings and queen, if I could call her that. And so we are forever in debt to the vision of those individuals. And those are some of the shoulders upon which we stand. So there are basically 3 points that I want to try to make this evening as briefly as possible. The first of which is that caring communities was a concept that was before its time. The second one was that it was a powerful response to the needs of the period. And the third is that we still need caring communities today. And so with the first construct of or idea about it being an idea before its time, I'm thinking about some specific things. I'm thinking about how you had 4 directors, very brilliant men, who were able to put aside their egos to figure out how to create a kind of a partnership, to pool their resources so that children and families and communities could thrive. And that was very uncommon then, and to some extent, it still is. But it certainly was uncommon at that time. And then they had this idea about not only top-down approaches where those who are in control, if you will, or who have responsibility for determining how funds would be allocated and who would receive them and so forth, and who would benefit from them. But they also understood and bought into this notion of the importance of bottom-up approaches, meaning that it was not enough then. And quite honestly, I would submit to you very respectfully that it's still not enough to simply have the support at the top level. Thinking about this bottom-up means valuing the voices, valuing the lived experiences, valuing the aspirations of those who are supposed to be the recipients of those services, recognizing that they know these systems in ways that we don't, and we know these systems in ways that they don't. And so bringing those two perspectives together was very, very different. And I would say it was very, very significant and instrumental in terms of whatever success we were able to achieve. I think the idea of helping to define nationally this whole notion of collaboration and service integration, that language now is probably old. But then it was very new, and we had interesting meetings and debates about nationally across jurisdictions and across communities about what that meant. And we always had a joke about collaboration was an uncommon act between consenting adults. And it was hard. And it is still hard. But it makes me think about a quote that I read one time that when I read it, it was attributed to Muhammad Ali. It may have been attributed to someone else, but it basically went something like this. Service to others is the rent we pay for the space we occupy on this earth. And so they came to St. Louis, Walnut Park, a very densely populated neighborhood with over 5,000 kids. It was probably the most densely populated neighborhood in the city of St. Louis. And they allowed me and the folks to not only identify the staff that I thought we needed to do this work, but they allowed me to take the risk and step out and ask residents what they wanted. And we formed this advisory board, and it was an essential part of the whole vision. We went door to door and asked people what did they want. And they never really talked about, well, we want latchkey, or we want, in-home family services, or we need day treatment. They would describe their needs, and then we would shape a strategy and a response around that. And to this day, I remember how every month when we met, Dr. Schaefer, Dr. Bagley, Dr. Boardman, Gary Stangler, in varying situations, some would make it, some would not, but there was always at least 2 state directors at those advisory board meetings. And I would tell you that in that community, there were very smart people. These were people who had been relocated after Pruitt-Igoe, the housing project, was destroyed, imploded or blown up, or whatever term we want to use. And they were relocated to that area. So they brought with them some real pride and some very strong insights about family. But then as time passed, their sense of hope began to become diminished. And to have those directors at those meetings, driving down, and sometimes Dr. Schaefer would fly down. I still have not flown with him and probably won't. But he always invited me, and I was like, no, bro, I'm not doing that. I love you, but we're not doing that. And they would come and they would sit there in those meetings. And the point I'm trying to make is that when we're working with these communities, when we're working with children, when we're working with families, when we're working with staff, probably the single most important thing to convey is that we care. And saying we care is a start, but showing we care is the finish. And by them coming to those meetings for the first couple of years and helping us figure out how to buy hot dogs through a very bureaucratic system to do our first community march was a real challenge. I think as Steve and I were joking at the table, and that was when he first became really immersed in this system. But it was a response because we had invited literally the whole community to come out, be a part of a health fair, be a part of a march, be a part of a demonstration of unity. And of course, when people come together, they want to eat. Now, that was new. Now, everybody has food at meetings. But then, you're going to do what? You're going to serve them who? Why are you doing that? Aren't you building some bad habits to make it you're buying people's favor by having them, giving them a meal just so they would come out? But they eventually understood that for some of those children and families, that was the meal for the day. And for others, even now, the idea of choosing between coming to an evening meeting or going home for dinner is not a difficult choice if there's no food at the meeting. But that's how far we've come. But at that time, that was a concept way ahead of its time. And so this idea of engaging students and parents, using schools as the base of operation. I mean, we understood what those three goals of school success, keeping kids out of the juvenile justice system and safely in their homes, meant that we had to have somewhere where we could engage children and families. But what we began to notice, and to some extent what we already knew, is that some kids were not coming. And those who did come, some were there physically, but not there mentally. Not because of a lack of intellect, but because of things that were happening to them in their homes and in their communities. We now appropriately talk about it as trauma. And we now have put together trauma-informed services. But we didn't have that language then. I think we were talking about targeted case management and looking at communities and serving folks if they were diagnosed as severely emotionally disturbed. That was the part of the evolution of how we think and approach. And so those were some of the very progressive things that to me indicated that caring community as a concept was ahead of its time. In terms of it being something that was a response, a really important response to the needs of that period, I think about a couple of specific pieces of legislation that we didn't talk much about, but it's my belief that those four directors and Jane knew about the legislation and came together in part because of it, also because they care then and now. The first of which was the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 1976. You may recall that during that period, there was a proliferation of gang violence across the country. The Bloods, the Crips, the Blackstone Rangers, the Latin Kings, the Gangster Disciples, and they had become much more sophisticated, actually had begun to get involved in a drug trade. They actually had a source of funding to sustain them, and so they became very powerful. That act said a lot of things, but one of the most important things was that it said it created a special category for 14-year-olds and classified them as designated felons, where they could basically be given longer sentences for certain crimes. And so the mood, the perspective, and public policy around juvenile justice had begun to shift from rehabilitation and treatment to accountability and punishment. The second piece of legislation that I would submit still has a huge impact on outcomes in families today was the Anti-Drug Act of 1986. This was the law that basically established mandatory 5-year sentences for the possession of 5 rocks of crack cocaine, as well as 500 grams of powdered cocaine. That law, in my humble opinion, has contributed more so than any other law that I can think of to the number of people who are currently incarcerated in our prisons today. And when that law was put into place, when parents were arrested and incarcerated, children went to foster care, or they went into the juvenile justice system, and the parents went to prison. And so we began to see whole communities become decimated by policies. And I have to say to you that those laws disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. And so to put together the kind of response that Caring Communities represented was a way to undo that. And I don't know if you all are familiar with those policies. I suspect that you are. But when we look now and we see that we have 2.3 million people in prison right now, and another 6 million on probation and parole, and 6 out of every 10 of those individuals are Black and brown, something is wrong with that. And so we have an opportunity to do something about it. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not condoning illegal behaviors. I'm not condoning criminality. What I would say is that, in continuation of that thought, is that I would be one of the first ones to say that certain people need to be locked up. Certain children do need to be protected and removed from their homes. Certain juveniles need to be held more accountable for the things that they do. But one of my basic questions is, are we always removing, detaining, arresting, and incarcerating the right ones for the right reasons? Are there other alternatives that we might consider? Diversion programs, Caring Communities type programs, re-entry programs that will help build or rebuild communities. And so with foster care between 1986 and 1999, the foster care population more than doubled. It doubled from 269,000 to 567,000. In juvenile justice, we saw that the detention rates doubled during that same period, 1985 to 1999, from a daily detention rate of 13,000 to 26,000. And then by 1999, or by 2006, 62% of the kids who were in detention were Black and brown children. And so I think, and I saw Caring Communities as a strategy to address those realities. And I still see that kind of approach needed more so ever than before. And then there was this whole culturally competent, culturally sensitive aspect to it that I think was important because those families had begun to lose hope, because many of them were beginning to hear and perceive that they were less than. The young man at the beginning that said he wasn't so angry because he didn't have a dad, he was angry because other kids had dads. And so this whole anger, this sense of resentment, this sense of being deprived can send a message to certain individuals that they are less than, even though we know that they're not. And so being culturally sensitive and culturally competent meant, first of all, to make sure that we gave those children and families something to be proud of. And then it meant making sure we hired staff who could model the kinds of behavior that would set an example that was more positive than some of the things that they were seeing. And then being, I often think about and joke about how across the street from the schools, the parents could peek through their blinds to see how our staff interacted with kids in the schoolyard. So we can say, yeah, we love your kids and so forth and so on, but they looked through those blinds, and if they saw us yanking on those kids, pointing our finger at those kids, yelling at those kids, walking away from those kids, and it'd be like, hey, you can say what you want, but you don't look like you care to me. So because we were there, literally, in some respects, 24/7, I worked kind of along with a bunch of other people around the country. I'm not trying to say that we were all that in a bag of chips. But what I am trying to say is that I think we help contribute to this whole notion of 24/7, a framework that people use quite freely now. But it literally meant that we needed to be available 24 hours a day because, you see, if a person is struggling with substance use disorders, and what I've learned is that when a person is struggling with that on an addiction, they will get help when they hit rock bottom. We will send them for treatment, and we should. Some of them will stay, some of them will recidivate or go back to those same behaviors. But when they hit rock bottom at 2 o'clock in the morning, and if they have somebody to call to say, I'm ready to go to the hospital, can you come get me? That's demonstrating care. If we say, oh, it's Saturday night, I'm getting ready to go out, check with me Monday morning, we've missed the opportunity. And so they knew our staff would be there. Now, staff used to really yell at me sometimes about, why are you making us do that? And that was when we had the little beepers and all that kind of stuff. But I always said to them, and I tried to demonstrate it, that if you got to go, I'm going. So when you get called, you call me. And so showing that we care is as important and even more important than saying we care. That was what those 4 state directors and Jane Payne allowed us to do, to be innovative, to listen to the voices of people, and to develop appropriate responses. Then the last thing, the point that I want to make is just this idea that I believe, with all due respect, that we still need something like caring communities. We still need really strong top-down, bottom-up approaches. But I can tell you, just as recent as last year, I was doing work in St. Louis Public Schools, and the superintendent there, Dr. Kelvin Adams, to me is a very brilliant man, very much like the 4 who helped create caring communities. And he understands that to have 1 or 2 social workers in a school where 100% of the families are Medicaid eligible and where violence is a norm, and to only have 1 or 2 social workers to deal with all of the trauma that those kids bring to school with them every day, he knows that that's insufficient. And you and I know it's insufficient. But in the absence of having a response to that that's healthy and speaks to well-being, those kids drop out or get suspended. And then they end up in the juvenile justice system, and some end up dying an early death. We're burying way too many young people, or they end up in the juvenile justice or the criminal justice system. I mean, we are now nationally actually suspending preschoolers. I was looking at some data not too long ago from the U.S. Department of Education Civil Rights Division. And the first time I read it, it floored me because I thought it was a typo. It basically pointed out that African-American children make up about 18% of the preschool kids, but 48% of the kids who are suspended or expelled. That's over 2.5 times how they're represented in that population. And white children make up about 43% of the preschool population and about 26% of the kids who are experiencing 1 or more suspension. Something's wrong when our systems cannot respond to the needs of babies. Something's wrong with our society when those things are happening to our babies that we find inexplainable. But I've looked at some studies, and there was one that was done not too long ago out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the focus was on this whole Family Medical Leave Act. And the hypothesis was basically taking a look at what happens to children and families when mothers have to go back to work before they're ready. Let me say that again. What happens to children and families when mothers have to return to work before they're physically, emotionally ready? And what they found is that, and I think there were over 15,000 participants in that study, and they found that a significant portion of those children did very poorly because, as you all know even better than I, the brain is not fully developed until an individual is 25 years old. And at the preschool age, the brain is just forming. And so they would do one of the experiments that they would use in the study was they would instruct the parents to lay the child on a bed or in a car seat or pumpkin seat or something like that. You all know what pumpkin seats are? Okay, my gray hair is also telling my age, right? But we're not gonna worry about that right now. And so they would lay the child in there, and then they would instruct it to sit right in front of the child and to be expressionless. And all of us who had the privilege of being around infants and so forth, they're laying there. If they're not having a bad day, they're blowing bubbles and they're kicking their legs and they're wiggling. They're trying to do stuff to make us laugh, and they're expressing their happiness. But the mothers were told to still not respond, to just stare. And so after a period of time, those infants would start to get very frustrated. They would become very irritable. They would cry. They would become distressed. And their cortisol levels, that fight or flight hormone, would generate some toxicity in that child's body and brain, and actually began to affect the brain architecture. So over time, those children began to see everything as a threat. Now, what 4-year-old, what 3-year-old, with all due respect, unless they're in a war-torn country, should be seeing things, common day experiences, as threats? But this is what is happening. These are major policy issues that are affecting certain communities at a higher rate than in others. And then we looked at some other data with respect to suspension rates, and we found that African Americans are 3 times more likely to be suspended than anyone else. And African American girls have the highest suspension rate for anybody except African American males. And that African Americans with learning disabilities were 3 times more likely to be suspended than white kids with a learning disability, and 4 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. Now, I'm raising these data not to make anybody feel guilty or shame or to point fingers or to make you angry. What I'm saying to you folks is that as a nation, we've come a long way, but we have not come nearly as far as our potential greatness would suggest. And that we need to look at the data to think about and ask a basic question: how is what we're doing going to affect everybody? And in particular, how is it going to affect Black and brown communities? And without that question, we will continue to do business as usual. And Gandhi was once quoted as having said, "When you love or care more about someone else's welfare than your own, only then can you say you love. And anything else is just business give and take." And so caring communities was not business as usual. Caring communities was not, let's do the run-of-the-mill kind of stuff. It was innovative. It was risky. The gray hair that you see these 3 men with now, they didn't get it recently. They got that when they was fooling with me back in 80, 86, 87, 89. The last piece of data that I just want to share with you, because it's so alarming and somewhat distressing for me. And again, I would preface this comment with the idea that there are people that need to be incarcerated. And there's no question about that, particularly for the 4 violent index crimes: murder, rape, assault, robbery. But in Missouri, the incarceration rate per 100,000 is 1,654 for Blacks and 404 for whites. What are the facts? What are our assumptions? What are our beliefs? And what, if any, are our stereotypes? And nationally, the rate per 100,000 is 1,408 for blacks and 275 for whites. Now, for some, not necessarily in this room, but some will hear that data and would say like, well, yeah, that's probably the way it should be. The data is not so unfamiliar. What's problematic is how we interpret it. Some will follow the thinking and the logic that there's something wrong with those people. They are more dysfunctional. They're more culturally pathological. Therefore, our services should fix them. Another perspective would say there's something wrong with the lack of opportunities for those families and their communities. And we should maybe be asking ourselves, not what's wrong with them, but what has happened to them. Very different paradigm. One that challenges all of us to continue to do the important work that you do. And then lastly, when I think about St. Louis, and I've lived in St. Louis most of my life, and I'm a proud St. Louisan. Many of you have heard of this concept called the Delmar Divide. Who has heard that concept, Delmar Divide? So Delmar is a street that runs east and west in the city, pretty much from downtown to the city limits and beyond. The residents north of Delmar in the city are 99% African American. The median household income is $22,000. The median property value is $78,000. And only 5% of the residents 25 years or older have a college degree or higher. Persons living south of Delmar, 70% white. The median income, household income, is about $45,000. The median property value is $308,000. And over 67% of the residents 25 years or older have a college degree or higher. That didn't just get like that. That is the result of housing policy that still affects and segregates communities today. Some would argue that America is still as segregated as it ever was. And so in rooms like this is where I have my hope. Because I believe that efforts to transform systems is probably the single most powerful vehicle to achieve social justice. Because in rooms like this, people care. In rooms like this, folks understand the complexity and the nuances of the issues. In rooms like this, there's access to resources, well, not just dollars, but ideas and people. And so I always have hope, always. And I reach out to you with my heart and my mind and my words to say, please continue to do the work. If you're a human being, you're a part of God's creation, you have a soul, in my humble opinion, and that's what gives you value. That's what gives us value. Not the clothes we wear, the degrees we hold, the value of our property, the number of our children who have graduate and postgraduate degrees. All those things are nice. But whether you are a person who is mentally ill, who's walking along the highway and asking for a handout, who may be a former veteran or maybe a person who aged out of foster care, or whether you are someone who has access to the finer things in life, you still have value. And so caring about everyone is important, everyone. But making sure that we not lose sight of the fact that there are some who are considered to be less than worthy. And unfortunately, it does often play out by class and color. And so I invite you to continue to do the work. I invite you to become even more committed, or at least maintain your levels of commitment. And I invite you to challenge yourselves and grapple with the very tough issues and look for both and win-win solutions and not either or win-lose kind of solution. So I thank you for the invitation. I hope I haven't spoiled your dinner. I'm really happy to be here, and may God continue to bless you. Peace.